So you just remember that. Not too much trouble to be nice to some young person. You never can tell when it'll work out all right. Because they do remember, just like your kids, they do remember. I want to say just a couple of words about Senator Fulbright. I wrote about him at length in my memoirs, and he did have a profound influence on my life, even long before I met him. You know, when we were growing up at home in the late 50s and early 60s, the whole image of my state was frozen in time by that awful encounter at Little Rock Central High School. And the crisis precipitated when the governor called out the National Guard to try to stop the court-ordered integration, and then President Eisenhower had to nationalize the Guard to ensure that it occurred. Everything seemed to be defined in terms of that. So I have against that background someone as sophisticated, as broad-minded, as progressive as Fulbright, representing us, was quite something for a school child in Arkansas who hoped to have a different sort of life and believed that public service could be a noble endeavor. Long before I ever got to the substance of what it was he believed and whether his theory of how the world worked and how American foreign policy should proceed, I was just impressed that you could actually have a good education and not redneck people to death and divide them and still win an election every now and then. I mean, and it turned out to be a rare quality even later on, even into the last few years. But you can't imagine what it was like. Keep in mind, we just been through the McCarthyite scare of the 1950s. We were having all these horrible racial conflicts, and, you know, here was this guy who spoke in complete sentence and coherent paragraphs, who talked about history and believed that, you know, the people he represented were just as smart as anybody anywhere else, and they just needed better opportunities and better education. It was an amazing thing. And he also wanted us to be connected to the rest of the world. In lieu of the current day's headlines, one of the ironies is that in the 1950s, thanks to Bill Fulbright, the University of Arkansas had the largest number of Iranian students in the university of any state university in the United States of America. It's very interesting. Remember that, Lee? And a very large number of students from the Middle East going to school across religious and cultural lines, trying to find a way to work together. Fulbright essentially thought that a country had to have a military, but that there were limits to what you could achieve militarily. And he believed that over the long run, the gains that we achieved through reasonable conversation and coming to a common understanding of our mutual interest, through really coming in contact with each other, are those that were most lasting. He wouldn't be surprised, for example, to know a stunning factoid, I will tell you. There is one and only one Muslim country where the public opinion of the United States has soared since 2003 and stayed high in the aftermath of Iraq. But it didn't start for a year later. Do you know what country it is? Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. And why? Because of the tsunami. When the president asked his father and me to coordinate a last part of the fundraising effort for tsunami relief, and then we went together to South Asia, we came back to make our report to the White House, and when I was on the way into the meeting with the president, one of the career people from AID who had worked with us and done a marvelous job handed me a poll completed just the day before in Indonesia, comparing attitudes of the United States and Osama bin Laden on that day with a year previous. Approval of the United States had gone from 36 to 60%. Approval of bin Laden had gone from 58 to 28%. Mr. bin Laden had done nothing to the Indonesians after the tsunami, but nothing for them either. And in a stunning moment, when they saw the military dropping food instead of bombs, when they saw the American civilian aid workers working, when they saw the non-governmental workers, both from religious and non-religious groups, show up, they saw all these American business people just spontaneously come over there and set up water purification equipment, people that didn't belong to any group. They just sort of showed up and found a place where clean water was needed. In a stunning moment, they saw us as people because we saw them as people. Across all the religious and geographic and political divides, in that terrible moment of tragedy, we were united in our common humanity. And a year later, according to a survey released just in the last week or so, those gains have endured. This would not surprise Bill Fulbright at all. He would say, now, if you see this, this is a big argument for why we should be spending more money in this age to make a world with more partners and fewer terrorists. And if you see this, it's a big argument for why doing things in a cooperative way works better than doing things in a unilateral way, because you can't solve all the problems all the time. We still have people, I'm sad to say, in my job for the Secretary General, who are still in tents in Indonesia, even though I said I'd get them out by 2 weeks ago. But as long as people think you're on their side and that you're walking down the same road together and you're prepared to share the future together, you can deal with the factual setbacks and the momentary disappointments. It's whether people feel like you're pulling for them and you have some regard for them and you wish to share the future with them. Doesn't mean we don't need a military, doesn't mean we should never be prepared to act on our own, but it means our preference should be, as Madeline says, you can run two kinds of foreign policy. I will just steal her phrase. You can cooperate whenever you can and act alone when you must, or you can act alone whenever you can and cooperate when there's no other alternative. And we believe the former is a far better policy. And so that was Fulbright's idea. And he was right about that. He also, I believe, would favor virtually every one of the international compacts that is still pending and hanging fire today, including the International Criminal Court, because it does have protections against the political prosecution of American soldiers who are sent around the world to save the peace, including the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty or the Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. He would think we ought to amend it, not destroy it. And the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, I know he supported because he supported it when it was just an idea. And he would say, okay, if you join all these things, they will limit our freedom of action, and these groups may make mistakes, but the question when you enter any compact is, are you better off in it than out? And the answer he would give is yes, because, go back to the Indonesian situation, people in the world need to know we're pulling for them. We need to be trying to build a world we would like to live in when we are no longer the only economic or political or military superpower. And if he were still alive today and at this podium, he would be giving you a speech using much more elegant and high-flown language than I do, telling you that that's what we should be doing. And I learned that from him. I read all his books, and then I had the chance as a young man to watch the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings on Vietnam, on America's role in the world against communism and what their objectives were in Asia beyond Vietnam. I watched the then Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, come in the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning sometimes and drink coffee with Senator Fulbright. I watched what it was like for people to have a civil, genuine human relationship in a bitter public disagreement. And I saw that you did not have to demonize your opponent in order to disagree with him. I learned a lot of stuff from Bill Fulbright. And the main point I wish to make today is that the enduring part of his legacy is more important now at the end of the Cold War, and more important now that he has left us, even than it was when he was alive. He made these arguments partly to keep the United States and Soviet Union from blowing each other off the map until we could figure out what the ultimate resolution of the Cold War was. Now, in a much more sort of complex, messier world, I think what he had to say to us about the importance of education, about the importance of mutual understanding, about the importance of cooperation is even more significant. Madeline will remember we used to have meetings in the White House sometimes, and we thought we might have to have military action on occasion. We did. We bombed in Kosovo for 77 days. In 98, the United Kingdom and the United States bombed what we thought were Saddam Hussein's storage sites for chemical and biological materials when he kicked our inspectors out. But sometimes we would have these debates where people would say, if I didn't take some military action this very day, people would look down their nose at America and think we were weak. And I always thought of Senator Fulbright and the terrible quagmire of Vietnam and how many times we sent more soldiers and we found ourselves in a hole and kept digging because we didn't want to look like we were weak. So anytime somebody said in my presence, if you don't do this, people will think you're weak, I always ask the same question for 8 years. Can we kill them tomorrow? I don't think we can bring them back tomorrow, but can we kill them tomorrow? If we can kill them tomorrow, then we're not weak. And we might be wise to try to find an alternative way. I learned that as a 20-year-old kid watching Bill Fulbright, listening, seeing all those senators on the Foreign Relations Committee at a time when they thought being a United States senator was an august responsibility and a grave one. That every time they went to a hearing, they had a profound obligation to be prepared. And we had a lot of bright people on the Foreign Relations Committee, including people that didn't agree with Fulbright, who were really smart, and they didn't have to have their staffs give them all the questions. They actually knew what they wanted to ask, and they knew about the history of Southeast Asia. And it was a fascinating time to be working there, to be young. And and David and Barbara tell you, everybody watched them on television. It was like high drama. So I would say to all of you today, in this interdependent world, we should still have a preference for peace over war, a preference for cooperation over unilateralism, a preference for investing more to build a world with more partners and fewer terrorists, since it's still a tiny fraction of what we spend on our military and on the specific conflicts in which we now find ourselves engaged. For a man who was in some ways very proper and very distant, not exactly your standard backslapping politician, Fulbright had an uncanny understanding that the purpose of politics was to create a framework in which people could live their personal lives according to their dreams. And that almost all aberrational behavior, whether it's impressing children into tribal wars in Africa or selling drugs or setting off bombs in marketplaces in Israel or Iraq or anywhere else, or in those hotels in Jordan, almost all aberrational behavior like that is basically the product of people who, for whatever reason, have decided to put their power lust ahead of letting children live their dreams. And he got that. And I tried